Hello, my name is Tim Shoebridge. Welcome to this video. Now this video is really in two parts. In the second part of the video, it's going to be really concentrating on the Moog One and a few different ways that we can put a little bit of vintage vibe into this really amazing synthesizer. But in the first part of the video, I want to talk more in general terms about this whole concept of vintage versus modern when it comes to analog synths and specifically polysynths. Now I think it's fair to say that pretty much all analog polysynths made today don't have quite the same sound as their distant cousins from the 1970s and the 1980s. If we take Moog One as an example, when it was first released, there was a definite sort of measurable disappointment by those people who were hoping for the sound of a vintage memory Moog, when in fact what we got was the sound of a very much modern analog polysynth. And it's not just Moog. There's loads of manufacturers, there are manufacturers out there creating analog polysynths today that are so precise in their sound, so clean, almost sterile sounding, that they might as well be digital synths to my ears. Now, I'm not for one moment blaming the manufacturers here. I really do believe that it's us as consumers that are responsible for the situation we found ourselves in. We turned our back on digital. We demanded analog, but we didn't demand that sound. We're not discerning enough. We rush out and buy a synth because it's got analog written on the box and VCO stamped on the front panel, not because of what the synth actually sounds like. If I think about the two most vintage sounding analog synths that I bought from new in recent memory, then they would be this one here, polysynth, and this one here, monosynth. Now I think there's a lot of factors going on in the difference in sound between a vintage synth and a modern synth. It's a very complex topic, but I do think that a lot of it has to do with precision, not just precision of tuning, but also precision of timing. Let's talk about tuning first. So most synth enthusiasts today understand the difference between DCOs and VCOs, digitally controlled oscillators and voltage controlled oscillators, and it's the understanding that the VCO is going to give us sort of the most kind of vintage sound, the most sort of unpredictability, because they are less precise in their tuning than DCOs. But the irony is that with the modern analog polysynths being produced today that have VCOs inside of them, that there's actually microprocessors inside those synths controlling those VCOs, controlling the voltages that go into those VCOs. It's those microprocessors that are running complex algorithms to make sure that the oscillators are always perfectly in tune. Some of them even have links to temperature sensors inside the synth to make sure that there's no variation in tuning with temperature changes. It's a fact, basically, that if you buy a modern day analog polysynth that doesn't require servicing and doesn't require that you open it up, get out a screwdriver and manually calibrate it, then there's going to be inside there a microprocessor that's controlling the tuning of your oscillators. Now, of course, it's not just tuning that is contributing to that vintage sound, it's timing as well. And it's really nice to see Dave Smith sticking his vintage knob in his latest Prophet 5 remake. You know, what that vintage knob is doing is not just, you know, varying the microprocessor generated voltages going into his VCOs, but it's also varying the microprocessor generated envelopes. You know, either lengthening or shortening the attacks, the decays and the releases, and probably a bunch of other parameters as well to give that kind of imprecision, the imprecision that a vintage synthesizer would have. Because let's face it, vintage synths had analog circuitry to generate their envelopes, not microprocessors. Right, so now's the time for us to turn our attention to the Moog One. It doesn't have a vintage knob, it doesn't have a slop control of any kind either. It's got something called pitch variance, which is hidden in the menu, and that actually sounds quite good. It gives a sort of a note-to-note variation in pitch, just a little bit of sort of like unpredictability, and it can sound really good. But it's not really the whole deal. It doesn't do oscillator to oscillator variation. It doesn't touch the filters. It doesn't go near the envelopes and stuff like that. So what I'm going to show you now for the rest of the video is just something I've been playing around with on the Moog One in its mod matrix. The mod matrix is incredibly feature rich. It's also quite complicated. I'm going to be rattling through this as quickly as I can and be as succinct as I can. So it's really got to be something that you're interested in watching, as always. But I'm going to go through and show you the steps that I've been taking to add some variation, not only to the oscillator pitches, but also to the filters and to the envelopes as well. So that's what's going to come up next. As always, I really do hope you enjoy it. Thanks very, very much for watching. Right, the first step for me really in trying to add a little bit of unpredictability to a patch on the Moog One is to try and find in the mod matrix a modulation source that'll give me that unpredictability, basically a sort of random values if you like. And if we go through the sources, we'll see all the normal suspects like LFOs and EGs, etc., mod wheel, pitch wheel, XY pad, all the way through. But as we get towards the right hand side, we'll find that there are some built-in modulation sources. And here are the first two that might be of interest. There's one called random and another one called random bipolar. Now these might seem like exactly what we're looking for, but actually I don't think they are. What they are is a continual stream of random values, not just one random value, and they're coming at you really quite fast, a bit like sort of a noise source if you like. So if I just show you what this one sounds like, this random one here, and I choose, say, the frequency of oscillator number 1, I've got an initialized patch going on here, but let's hear what that sounds like. I'm going to start off at 0 and then introduce this random value. So you can get a sort of an idea of what's going on with it. Just going to hold down one note and turn it up. So there you can hear, it really is like noise. It's all over the place, and that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for something that'll give me a little bit of a different value, randomly chosen each time I hold down a note. So let's just set this back down to 0. So if we get past random, which is going from 0 up to whatever value you choose, and then we've got random bipolar, which is going plus or minus up to the value you choose. The next one actually is the one I've ended up sticking with. It's called random keyed number 1. There's actually 3 of them. Like that, 1, 2, 3. They weren't there right at the very beginning when the Moog One was released. They were added a little bit later on in a firmware update. But what these guys do is give me a random value between 0 and whatever number I choose each time I press a key or play a note via MIDI or whatever. So let me show you what that sounds like. So we're again going to modulate the frequency of the oscillator number 1. Let's just put in, say, 10%. and each time I press a key you'll hear a different tone. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually turn on a second oscillator, and I'm going to introduce that very slowly so you can actually hear what note I'm playing, and then you can hear what random note oscillator number 1 is giving me. So you might be able to notice there that the random value, the random frequency being generated, it's always higher than the note that I'm playing. And that's because these random keyed values here, they are not bipolar. They go from 0 upwards to the maximum whatever I set here. They're never going to be negative. I mean, I can make them negative. I can say that the value should be, say, -24, and then it'll always be lower than 0. But they're not sort of true random values fluctuating above and below 0. And that's ideally what I want. I want a bipolar random value, because I want to, you know, randomly, I don't know, set the pitch of an oscillator slightly higher, next note slightly lower. I might want to lengthen an envelope one key press, but then shorten it the next. I'm really looking for bipolar. So the next thing I need to do is see how I can change these random keyed values into bipolar values. Right, so what I ended up deciding upon to create bipolar values out of unipolar values is to use a transform function. This is a very powerful aspect of the mod matrix in the Moog One. We've got this third column here, which is a transform. And I have to say, I don't know what some of these things do, but I've sort of, like, you know, just by experimentation found out about a few of them. What I'm going to do is choose function and then go down to the second line. And there's a whole load of different things that we can do here. Some of them are quite complicated, but there are actually 3 functions that I'm going to concentrate on, and that's these ones here. This one is a sine function, then we've got a triangle function, and then a saw function. These are actually digital waveform generator functions. They'll generate sine waves, triangle waves, and sawtooth waves based on the input, the S and the C. The S stands for the source modulation value, whatever we give it, and the C stands for the controller modulation value if we set one. So based on the values that we pass into these functions, we'll get back a value which will represent a point on a sine wave or a triangle wave or a sawtooth. Now the reason why these functions are interesting to me is because sine waves, triangle waves and sawtooth waves are bipolar waveforms. And the best way for me to sort of like show you this is sort of diagrammatically. You'll see that the waveform goes from 0, it goes positive up to 100%, down through 0, down to negative 100%, and then back up again. Now, although the shape of each of these functions is different, saw, triangle, and sine, the end result is still the same. If you passed in there a random value, you'd get randomly back something, some sort of point along the waveform. And since they all spend half their time above 0, half their time below 0, any of these 3 functions will do for me. So what I'm going to do now is try and sort of like show you what happens when I pass a value into, say, this sine function. So what I'm going to do is choose something rather neat that we have here as a modulation source, and it's actually towards the end, it's an inbuilt source. It's called constant, and what you can do is you can just choose a value that you want to use as a modulation source and pass it in to this function. And then what I'm going to do with it is I'm going to, as before, I'm going to modulate the frequency. So I'm going to pass in a value into this function. The value that comes back from this function is then going to set the frequency of oscillator number 1. What I'm going to do is start off down at 0, slowly turn this up and let's see what happens. So holding down a note, and we're getting a click. That means that the frequency of oscillator 1 is really, really low. It's at its lowest it can possibly go. Now let's see what happens as I turn this up. %, we get a good tone. By 50%, it's gone so high that I don't think even a dog could hear it. Now, as we turn it again, we keep going up, so we get to 75%. It's back down to a sensible tone again. And then as we get up to 100%, it's gone back down to a click. It's gone back down to the lowest it can possibly go. So if I map that for you on a little diagram, you'll see how this sine function is working based on a value being passed into it that's somewhere between 0 and 100%. Now obviously then I was sweeping through this constant value from 0 to 100, sequentially. But if it was a random value anywhere between 0 and 100%, it would return me half the time of a random value below 0 out of this sine function, and half the time a random value above 0. And that's exactly what I want. This is turning a unipolar percentage into a bipolar percentage. Okay, so I hope I'm not losing you with this. There's a little bit of maths here, I can tell. But anyway, let's now see how we can apply this sine function to these random keyed values and get them to modulate the pitch of one of the oscillators. So I'm going to choose the source that I had before, random value or keyed value number 1. That one. I'm going to pass it into a function, a transform function. That function is going to be sine wave, but as I've said before, it doesn't matter which one of these three functions I choose, sine, triangle, saw, they'll give me the same result. Right, so that's the function, and then we're going to modulate the frequency. So the question is, how much of this random keyed value should I be passing in? Well, actually, I need to pass in a value somewhere between 0 and 100% in order to get the full range of the sine wave. So that's what I'm going to have to do, is set that up like that. Now, if we hear what that sounds like, it's going to be quite extreme. I mean, most of the time I'm hammering down on the key there and you can't hear anything because the frequencies are so high or so low that it's just a click. It's really not usable. What I need to do is, whatever the result of that sine function is, I need to tame it. I basically need to sort of like scale it all the way down to a very manageable amount. The same way I'd scale an LFO down to a really manageable amount if I wanted to have just a little bit of vibrato. You're talking about quite small changes in frequency give quite a big result. So what I'm going to do here with this line is, rather than just directly modulate oscillator number 1, I'm going to actually stick my modulation into a variable. This is another really, really powerful feature of the mod matrix and the Moog One, is you can assign the result of a modulation to a variable and then use that variable later on in another modulation. So I'm assigning it to variable number 1, and then in the next row I'm going to use that variable as a modulation source. Variable number 1, I'm going to use it to modulate oscillator 1 frequency, but rather than use the whole value. I'm scaling it right down to a tiny amount. Let's just go with 1%, and even 1% is too much. So just to follow here, I'm taking a random keyed value anywhere between 0 and 100%. I'm passing it through a sine function, which turns it into a bipolar amount, and then I'm saving it as a variable so that on the next line I can use it or just scale it down to 1% of its normal size and modulate the frequency of oscillator 1 with it. And this is what I get. I'm going to say up to 10%, so it's a little bit more dramatic, and like before I'm going to turn up oscillator number 2 so you can hear what actual note I am playing. If I turn down oscillator 1, that's my reference note, that's the note I'm actually playing. And hopefully you can hear there that the frequency or the pitch that I'm setting for oscillator number 1 is randomly going above it and below it. It is bipolar. So that's basically what we need to do. Well, that's what I ended up doing at least. I ended up taking a random keyed value, passing it through a function to make it bipolar, saving it as a variable, and now I've got it as a variable. I can use it in multiple modulation matrix rows. I could use it to vary the pitch of an oscillator, and I could also use it to vary the cutoff frequency of a filter. I could use it to vary the attack or the decay or the release time. I've got it there as a variable, and I can use it over and over again. And the wonderful thing is here that Moog have given us not just one variable that's random, but actually 3 of them. So we can set up 3 different random values every key press and use them to modulate lots of stuff. Right, so I've set up the mod matrix now so that we've got 3 of these random keyed values. Number 1, 2 and 3. They're all going through their sine functions and they're being saved as 3 separate variables. Variable number 1, variable number 2 and variable number 3. So once we've got those 3 lines in place at the top of the mod matrix, they're there for us to use those variables everywhere and anywhere we want to. So all I've done here for the rest of this patch is I've used each of those variables as modulation sources, var1, var2 and var3. And I've scaled them right down really small to 1%, but actually trust me, that's still not small enough for sort of a realistic kind of variability of pitch. And I am using them to vary oscillator 1 frequency, oscillator 2 and oscillator 3 frequency. So if I turn on all 3 oscillators, and let's just make sure they're sort of like mixed fairly similarly. Okay. And now play a note. Okay, it's very dramatic, it's way too out of tune to be useful, but you can hear there that it is changing from note to note. So let's try and scale down these numbers to something that's a little bit more realistic. And this is where there's a shift button on the front panel that really helps, because we can get absolutely incredible precision. You know, if you have any doubt about the fact that the Moog One is an incredibly precise synth, now look at this. I can change this variable down to 0.01%. I'm actually going to go down to let's try 0.05. Let's try that. Do it for each one. I mean, these numbers, you know, when you're setting up patches on the Moog One, it can sometimes feel like you are sitting in front of a scientific instrument and not a musical instrument, because the precision on this is really quite amazing. So let's go down to 0.05% on each of those 3. Let's see what that sounds like. I think that's quite nice. It's sort of it reminds me of a vintage synth that you can't quite tune perfectly. What I'm going to do with these, actually, these three modulation rows I've got here, is just add a controller to them. If I add the mod wheel in here for each one, then I can turn these modulations on and off really simply by just turning up and down the mod wheel. Then you'll hear the difference. So this is with the mod wheel off. And this is with it on. Now, my particular Moog One, that's with the mod wheel off. My particular Moog One is very, very slightly out of tune from one oscillator to the next anyway, and I think that it's out of tune, you know, really nicely, actually. I mean, I know there are people out there whose Moog Ones are out of tune by a lot more than this, and then they have to use that sort of frequency calibration setting on the synth. I just don't like that frequency calibration setting. It makes everything sound so precisely in tune and sterile. I just don't like it. So if you are using that frequency calibration setting on your Moog One, then having this kind of variability between the oscillators in terms of their frequencies is going to really give you a bit more of a natural vibe. Right, so far we've only been varying the frequencies of the oscillators. In this patch I've gone a bit crazy. So I've still got my three keyed random values at the top here, being set as variables. And then I've got my three oscillator frequency modulations going on there as before. But now I've added ladder filter cutoff, a little bit of variation, because let's face it, you know, from one voice to the next on a polysynth, on a vintage polysynth, you know, the ladder filter cutoff is not going to be exactly the same. It's going to be, you know, there's going to be some slight variances there. It's not going to be calibrated perfectly. So I'm adding a little variance there to the cutoff. I'm also adding a little bit of variance to the ladder resonance as well. Now obviously on a Moog One there are two filters, there's a state variable filter and a ladder filter, but on this particular patch I'm just going to use the ladder filter just for simplicity. Then what I've done is I've taken the first two envelope generators, the filter envelope and the amplitude envelope. I've taken three of the parameters, because there's quite a few parameters for each envelope generator. I'm just taking the basic attack, decay and release, and as you'll see here I am modulating them. Same with these variables again, and I'm choosing 20%. In fact, I've made a mistake there. That's 100. That'll be a bit extreme. Let's go down to 20%. And then for EG number 2, the second envelope generator, I'm doing the same thing, but using different variables. So I'm not using the same variable on both envelope generators for the attack, decay and release phases. I've mixed them up a bit. So that's basically what I've got there. But first of all, I've got to apply a bit of a filter to my patch and add some envelopes in there so that we get a sound where we can hear the difference that this makes. And the other thing I just want to mention is I've set the mod wheel on every single one of them, so I can easily turn them off, turn them on, so hopefully we can hear the difference. Right, so this is the sound with the mod wheel down, so this is no modulation at all. Very same sound each time. Now I crank up the mod wheel. Then mod wheel off. Mod wheel on. So really it needs experimentation, it needs playing around with these values and getting what you think works best. And to be honest with you, it's going to be different depending on the patch that you've got. You know, if you've got a patch with a really snappy envelope, then 20% variation may or may not sound really audible to you, but it might well sound more audible on a very long decay, which would otherwise be, you know, 5 seconds, but now is 6 seconds long. So it all depends on the kind of patch that you've got as to what values here really make sense. So hopefully that's given you some ideas of what you can do to add some, you know, unpredictability and variety to various parameters that you might choose. You know, you might be going after a kind of a vintage kind of feel, or it might be that you just want to add some randomness to your filter cutoff or a frequency, for example. So that's what you can do with these random keyed values. And turning them into sort of bipolar random values. Now you might think this is a real pain in the arse to add all this in for every single patch that you want to do, but another really cool feature about the Moog One is that you can create you know, a modulation matrix like this and then save it. You've got this save button at the top here. I can give it a name. I can even write some notes as well to sort of describe what's going on in it and how you might want to use it. And once you've saved it, you can then go to any patch that you've created or any preset that's a factory preset, and you can add those modulations in. You can either overwrite whatever modulations are already there, or you can add to them. You know, the only thing you really need to you know, concern yourself with is here I'm using some variables. Just make sure that whatever patch you're loading these into isn't using the same variables, otherwise you'll get some unpredictability going on there. So that's the only thing to really be concerned about. I mean, obviously here I'm using up a lot of lines. I'm using up 14 rows in the mod matrix, which is a lot. But you know, if I've not got all 3 oscillators working, then there's absolutely no need to be modulating all 3 of them. In fact, I might actually not bother to modulate, say, the first oscillator, for example. It's, you know, it all comes down to experimentation, playing around, and getting the kind of sound that you want. So the last thing I want to do in this video is just play to you just a few different patches that I'd already I'd already created them on the Moog One, you know, weeks and months ago. But I've applied these modulations, these variability modulations to them, so you can hear the kind of effects that they'll have on the patch. So I'll be playing the patch without and then with. Just a few different examples so you can get a kind of feel for it.